Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Huston, our treasurer and a PCNS fellow and all sorts of wonderful things. And he will talk to us tonight about the worst coin portraits in history. Take it away.
In tonight's presentation, you're going to see some of the worst coin portraits in history. This presentation grew out of several earlier projects I tackled. I did a slideshow about 30 years ago at a coin convention on a history of portrait coins from ancient to modern. And then about 20 years ago, I put together a talk about numismatics in the Dark Ages. And then I continued that research and did an entirely different paper this year about Dark Age numismatics or Dark Age coins. And this is a new presentation focusing just primarily on what happened with portraits. So when I tell people that they're going to see the worst portraits in history, they start thinking immediately of a few of the less artistic US coins from recent decades. A couple that I can recall people complaining were particularly unartistic were the Susan B. Anthony and Ike dollars. Here's the Anthony dollar along with several actual photographs of our subject. Frankly, it's hard to find a better portrait without drastically misrepresenting her. Same with our president from the 50s. The coins of his struck throughout most of the 70s don't make you think of him immediately unless you already know about him, because all of his official portraits were done full facing. It took me a long time to find this 3/4 facing photo of him even, but I couldn't find any images of him in profile. However, it's obvious that these are excellent coin portraits in the sense that they actually look like the person they are depicting. So now let's take a brief stroll back through the history of portraits that I showed 30 years ago. This will be much shorter than that because I have a whole lot more to cover. So here's Ptolemy I of Egypt, who's often credited with having struck the earliest portrait coins. In fact, he's credited with striking the first portrait coin of Alexander the Great, which he struck after Alexander had died. So it wasn't a portrait of a living person. But then he put his own portrait on coins a few years later, just before 300 BC. So most scholars say he was the first. However, here's a portrait of an Eastern governor in a Greek province struck in the 5th century BC, way more than a century before Ptolemy became king of Egypt. And here's another of a Persian satrap from an area nearby in the Greek colonies. And another with a portrait of Mithridates, who ruled in Lycia around 375 in the before the Common Era, BCE. And finally, a stunning face of Pericles of Lycia, struck around 360 BC. So Ptolemy was not the first by a long shot. Moving into the Roman period, we get portraits of the emperors, which are reasonable likenesses of the men named on the coins. Here we have Nero, Vitellius, and Antoninus Pius from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD or CE. And a bit later in the Roman era, we get to Constantine the Great, whose portraits usually feature a distinctive nose as the most telling detail about his face. Then after that, we have the Emperor Valens, who ruled a few years later. He looks enough like a real person to believe that this is still actually a portrait. But as we move into the Byzantine era, after the so-called fall of Rome, portraits go sideways. Often a crown is the main clue as to who's the emperor, especially if there's multiple faces on a coin. Along with their inscriptions, of course, which give their names and titles, which sometimes is the only way to identify the only face on the coin. But the quality of the portraiture from this period is truly laughable. There's no way to tell one face from another except by the beard and by deciphering the inscriptions. As we move on to medieval Europe, away from the Byzantines in the East, portraits deteriorated to crude line drawings and stick figures, not much better than you might get from a modern first grader asked to draw a picture of their parents. This was typical of coinage for much of that era, when you even got a portrait, which was rare. Moving on into the late medieval, early Renaissance period, we see improvements in design, but the faces are still completely impersonal, and the designs used for one king would have served perfectly well for the next king by just changing a few letters in the inscription. This goes on until the time of Elizabeth I of England, more or less. The overall design indicated more than the face itself, which is a good thing, because here Elizabeth looks more like a villain from a modern slasher film than a medieval queen. Her crown, scepter, and the rose symbol on her galley, along with the large E on her flag, provide the specific evidence needed to identify her, that face looks like something out of the Scream. But things changed during her reign. As we move closer to Renaissance portraits, it's entirely possible that someone seeing her later coin might actually recognize her if they saw her in person. And of course, then as we get well into the Renaissance, Italy and France joined in the portrait games. And what we found here is that it was mainly painters and sculptors in Florence who led the pack in developing Renaissance portraits. There were no such people as metallists in Italy at the time. It was the painters and the sculpture makers who tackled metal and created the portraits for which they became famous. This continued into modern times, and there's a couple of late British portraits. And that was basically the gist of my portrait talk 30 years ago, although I spoke for an hour and showed hundreds of slides. Okay, so I've trimmed this down, but there's a lot more I want to cover tonight. I want to take a closer look at what led to the worst portrait coins in history, and I want to start with the idea of a portrait as being an accurate depiction of a real human's face or head. Here's the Mercury dime, also called the Liberty Head dime because of the huge letters around the head that say Liberty. It was designed by Adolf Weinmann, and it was struck for 30 years beginning in 1916. Now, Weinmann never named his model, but a lot of people who knew his work figured out who it was, that it was a neighbor who posed for him in a lot of his works, including statuary, some of which was exhibited at the Panama Pacific International Expo in San Francisco the year before the dime was released. Similarly, we know the model for James Earl Fraser's Indian head or buffalo nickel. Fraser identified his model publicly on numerous occasions. Fraser named Chief Irontail, but he also mentioned Chief Two Moons, along with several others. In all, Fraser is known to have named either 5 or 6 individuals and eventually claimed it was a combination of 2 or maybe 3 of them, and he couldn't recall which ones. So I'm not sure we can call this a portrait, maybe just a carefully researched type or even a stereotype. Now I want to go back to ancient coins and think about the idea of coin models and accurate presentations of people. Here are 2 heads from hundreds of years BC that represent the city of Syracuse. They are obviously very different, even though they theoretically represent the same thing. But if you look at the faces and the overall features, you'll notice that the eyes, the mouth, and the neck are entirely different on the ones on the right and on the left. The one on the left has muscles or maybe little rolls of fat in the neck, just like you might see on a real person, while the one on the right is greatly idealized. But I bet if you had been walking around Syracuse at the time this coin, the first coin was released on the left, you might have spotted someone who looked like that model. And this is centuries before portrait coins. Okay, so moving on to Ptolemy. Here's Ptolemy with some of his other known portraits, which were contemporaneous with him. Portrait heads and a bust from statuary. These coins actually looked like the king, judging from his other portraits. Moving on into Roman times, early emperors were depicted as they actually looked, and I'll emphasize early emperors. On the left, we have a fairly boyish portrait of the young Nero with a statuary bust of him in the middle and a much later portrait of him on the right after he's put on some weight and lost his boyish charms. Still, it's obvious from all of these that they represent the same person, so they are good portraits. A century later, we see Antoninus Pius, both a portrait bust and on his coinage. There's no question but that these are the same guy, so it's highly probable he really looked like this. But let's move on another century. And here we get coins of three rulers who all ruled within a year of each other around 270 AD. This is Claudius II Gothicus on the left, Quintillus in the middle, and Aurelian on the right. Is there any chance if you had run into these three guys standing together on the street that you could have used these coins to tell them apart? I don't think so. At the end of that century, Rome's empire ranged all the way from Britain to Africa and east all the way to the edges of Persia. And the Emperor Diocletian, who was still striking those radiate bust types that we saw on the previous slide, decided to change the coinage. He abandoned the radiate head that was known as the Antoninianus in favor of a larger bronze that was simply called the phallus. This larger bronze, if you find a really pristine one, it even shows traces of silvering on it because they made them look like silver when they put them into circulation by blanching them so that the copper was leached out of the top layer. But here's what both of his coins looked like when they were still circulating side by side when he reformed the coinage in 294. Now, he made some other changes. Instead of wanting the empire to continue with him as the ruler, he decided they should split it up, put one ruler in the east and one in the west, and have the two of them share power, and they should each appoint a junior emperor to take over when the senior emperors retired. Now, no emperor had ever retired. They were either killed or died in some other way while emperor. So instead of chaos and war, which seemed to follow every emperor's death, the senior emperors would retire after 20 years and each be replaced by their juniors, who would then appoint their own heirs to take over when their retirement time came. It was an attempt to stop the chaos and war that was causing trouble all throughout the empire and had been for most of a century. So the empire was officially split up among four rulers. Here's portrait coins of three of them. I just happened to find these all together and said, yeah, I'll show those. Not because they're special in any way, they're typical. But again, here, the portraits all look roughly the same. Without the inscriptions around them, you probably wouldn't be able to tell one from another. And the whole point of having an identifiable portrait had been lost because the emperors were supposed to now be interchangeable. And Diocletian retired, and one of his juniors, Constantius, was elevated in his place, but then Constantius died. And we get this guy, Constantius's son, Constantine, who was not a junior emperor, but decided that he preferred the old hereditary system, so he declared himself emperor anyway. In almost no time at all of the appointed emperors and all of the potential heirs to all the previous emperors declared war on each other. And 2 decades of war ensued. That's what came out of the great tetrarchy system that Diocletian thought would end chaos and war. Constantine eventually won, but his empire was financially weakened, and there was a vast population just trying to stay out of harm's way and get basics like food. The economic reforms of Diocletian and Constantine were rather impressive. They froze prices across the entire empire and made the prices uniform. So a loaf of bread cost the same in Constantinople as it did in Rome or as it did in Alexandria. The problem was that that wasn't where the supplies were. Bread was brought in from Egypt more often than not, and so prices were suddenly completely out of whack in spite of being regulated by law, and everything in the economy devolved into a black market. People abandoned the cities, left skilled jobs for agrarian areas where at least they could find food. Here's Constantine with his 2 sons. You can notice that the 2 sons' faces don't look much different. They were brothers after all. Actually, these 2 were half brothers, but it's not important anymore because they weren't supposed to look individual. So Constantine's family ruled for half a century, roughly, until the time of Julian the Apostate, the last of Constantine's family, a nephew. He was elevated when Constantine's sons all finally died off. He's shown here with the beard, but that was really a throwback to pre-Constantinian styles, which he grew the beard to emphasize his rejection of Christianity as the official religion. But this style ended with him, and the later rulers show themselves barefaced for the most part until the end of the empire, because they accepted Constantine's religious policies. So here's Valens a year later in the Eastern Empire, and Gratianus a few years after that, and Theodosius, who briefly reunited the Eastern and Western Empire for part of the 16 years that he ruled at the end of the 4th century. And then Arcadius, who ruled primarily in the East from the end of the 4th century into the 5th century. And finally, Honorius, who was his co-ruler but outlived him and ruled for 28 years. This is beyond the empire's loss of the Western provinces, basically all of Europe. By this time, there were probably few, if any, skilled mint workers outside of the main mint cities in the East. In the West, nobody was being trained for artistic efforts or professions, which required time to learn because they were too busy worrying about getting food, and many of them had abandoned the cities. So we can see that the vestiges of individual portraiture fade badly after Julian. Other than a slight tendency to chubbiness for Valens, the rest of them could be interchangeable. The portrait head on the coin has become a placeholder simply representing the empire. There's no chance you could guess who the ruler is from the later ones all by themselves. And the portrait coins, believe it or not, were about to get a lot worse. Soon after Honorius's death, portrait coins deteriorated to barely being mistaken for human. This coin of Valentinian III could have been engraved by Picasso. No matter, because all it had to do was have a generic head on it. If you need to know who it was, you read the inscription. In the eastern part of the empire, what we now know as the Byzantine area, we see caricatures emphasizing crowns and beards around completely unrecognizable facing heads. Even the inscriptions deteriorated in the East because both Greek and Latin were spoken there, and the official language was Greek written in Latin. And so we end up with coins from the Byzantine Empire with a mixture of Greek and Latin letters in the same words, just mixed together haphazardly to spell out the word if you knew both sets of letters. Here is Leo III and his son Constantine, who ruled together from about 720 for a few years, and then Constantine V ruled on his own for another 21 years. There's no real way to tell the difference between the two of them except by the inscriptions. Constantine, being the son, is shown barefaced, while Leo has a faint beard, and that was often an indication of who was the senior ruler. However, worse is to come, because the breakdown of the government in the Western Empire happened completely by the early 6th century. The light pink area shown at the east side of the map represents what was left of the Byzantine Empire. The darker reddish pink in the middle, encompassing all of Italy, represents the Ostrogothic kingdom. And you can see Celts, Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths, even Vandals down in North Africa, taking up the rest of the empire. So in Italy, Theodoric the Ostrogoth ruled from capitals at Ravenna and Rome. And after a lot of back and forth with the Byzantine emperor, he was allowed to rule as the Western emperor on the condition that he defend the borders of Europe. He managed with mixed results until Attila the Hun came along. And Attila defeated Theodoric, who got the royal treatment in death. They built him a massive tomb in Ravenna, and it's now appropriately known as the Mausoleum of Theodoric. The upper chamber was his burial vault, capped with a monolithic stone of 240 tons, more than twice the size of any stone at Stonehenge. In the upper chamber sits his sarcophagus. It's still there. You can go see it. However, in modern times, it was finally established that his sarcophagus was actually a Roman bathtub that had apparently been salvaged from one of Rome's abandoned public bathhouses to be put in service as the burial container for Theodosius or Theodoric. So Attila is the guy who took him out. Here's the only image I could find of Attila. It's from the 1300s. He didn't strike any portrait coins. He didn't make any portraits. By the late medieval period, when this was drawn, it was customary to depict older rulers without any regard for their actual portraiture, because no one knew what they looked like. They were dressed up in modern garb for the time of the artist, as whatever rank would have been appropriate to the person at their time. So here is Attila the Hun dressed up as a 14th century European king. After Attila attacked Rome, the barbarians swept into Europe, destroying the last bits of order for the empire and establishing petty kingdoms. They had no experience in coining or even in how to keep an economy running. There were no official mints still functioning, and the new rulers had no experience with either coins or portraits. They did have access to a small amount of existing older Roman coinage. In addition to the things being found around, many of them had treasure chests full of the goodies they had gotten by threatening the Roman Empire. So they had that loot. There were lots of coins they could look at, but they didn't know how to make them. This is a coin of Baduila the Ostrogoth. They took a Roman obverse of the Emperor Anastasius complete with the original emperor's name still around the head, and then put Baduila's name in a wreath on the reverse. The obverse die might actually have been an original die for Anastasius that was found. The lower right shows a 42 Numis coin struck for Hilderic the Vandal. He was copying Roman designs from some extremely late Roman material and using denominations copied from the Byzantines, striking coins at Carthage. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian and Hilderic actually were allies because Hilderic controlled the western North African coast, and Justinian controlled the eastern North African coast. So they sort of had each other's borders there to keep things safe. But a Vandal usurper named Gelamor took Hilderic and imprisoned him, and Justinian found out about this and sent his general Belisarius to restore Hilderic in Carthage in 533. When Gelamor heard that Belisarius had landed, he executed Hilderic, and then Belisarius, on Justinian's orders, wiped out the entire Vandal kingdom in North Africa in response. Here's another Visigoth. This is Wamba, king of the Visigoths, around the 670s AD. He copied a Byzantine gold coin, but with a very crude inscription indicating his name, though it's almost impossible to decipher. And the reverse carries a cross on a platform with his titles around. But the basic portrait could be used for any ruler. It's now become so hopelessly unlifelike. And similar portraits were struck. Here's King Egica of the Visigoths a few years later. But the copying gets worse. Here's a facing head struck for Ervig, the Visigoth, around 680. Police sketch artists, eat your hearts out. Look what they managed to do. They stuck ears on a crude drawing of a head and put a box on top for a crown. So this must be the ruler, right? Wrong. The engraver, if you could even call him that, didn't copy an earlier royal portrait. He copied a Byzantine gold solidus that featured a bust of Christ on one side. The protruding ears and the square crown on the left were originally 3 points of the cross behind Christ's head. Something got seriously lost in translation here when the Byzantine head of Christ became a Visigothic king's portrait. The Franks weren't doing any better in Northern Europe. Here's another Picasso-like portrait on the left, and here's another one from late that century in the same area. Notice in the second one on the right that the cross and the face seem to have become merged into some new portrait style. In the abandoned Roman province of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had settled in, and they didn't improve coinage much either. The coin on the left was struck at London for Eadbald around 640 AD, and the one on the right was struck near Kent around 700 AD. Remember, the coiners at this point are copying old coins. They're not attempting to make portraits of real people. They aren't even using models. Their models are the older coins. So the idea of a face was all that was actually expected for a portrait coin. Perhaps the best known portrait coin from Dark Age Britain is King Offa of Mercia. Struck as late as 796, this has a clear inscription of his name and rank, Offa Rex, around his head. But you couldn't mistake that head for a real person if you were trying to match it up. But Charlemagne, who was ruling the Franks in Central Europe, saw this and said, I'd like to do that. So when he became the Western emperor by agreement with the Byzantine king or emperor, He issued his own portrait coin. They're extremely rare. This broken example is one of the nicest known. It looks a lot like the late Roman coins where everybody's face started to run together anyway. But this is 400 years later. That's the kind of coin he was copying. His son, Louis the Pious, continued the portrait coin idea into his own reign, also copying a Roman coin. This is probably from a century older than the coin that Charlemagne used as a model. This looks more like one of the Antonine emperors. But Roman coins were copied elsewhere with even less success. Here is a Frisian portrait from Northern Europe that looks more like the head of a hairy ape. And in keeping with that style, but going back a little bit closer to the Roman, we see King Alfred of Wessex in Britain striking coin at London with a very crude impersonal portrait, but his name and title around, although you might have trouble making out half of the letters because they aren't always positioned as we'd expect them to be. Similar designs were used throughout the 9th century in Anglo-Saxon Britain, usually copying directly from Roman coins, which for the late coins they were finding, they were already generic portraits from the Romans. King Edgar struck a nice silver penny late in the 10th century in England, but his portrait is basically a line drawing of a head with a crown, much in the style of the low-grade Antoninianus radiate coins we saw in the late 3rd century at Rome. In the 11th century in Norway, there's hardly any coinage being issued at all. This is a coin of King Olaf Kyer, son of Harold. He struck this in a low-grade silver. It was very lightweight and very small in size, but they are extremely rare. In fact, almost all Dark Age portrait coins are rare. But this is my favorite for the contest for worst portrait coin in history. You can tell it has a face in profile, but it looks more like the drawing of a hedgehog. It's not even clear if he has a chin with a beard or if the face just fades away below his notable proboscis. However, there's a crown and a scepter in front of him, although the crown might look like just a bad hair day on some examples. Or maybe it's the hedgehog spines. So what happened with coin portraits in Europe? Why did it happen? Well, first, the emperors Diocletian and Constantine messed up the Roman economy by freezing prices everywhere and making them uniform. And then, beginning a somewhat feudal style of government, ordered that everybody stay where they were and in their same jobs for life, and that their children inherited that. Supplies became extremely uneven, prices rose, but it became a black market, and people fled the cities where tax collecting was most well organized. What money there was accumulated in the hands of the rulers, but it was no longer being recirculated into the economy by the time the barbarians took over. So the portraits had already become interchangeable by this time. And circulation of coinage was declining, so the coin supplies simply dried up. On the rare occasions when barbarians bothered to strike coins, usually to facilitate local tax collection, they made no effort at original coins, but copied older coins. And if you keep copying something from one to another, it invariably gets bad. They added their own names to the resulting coins, but during this period, we also had continuous recirculating plagues. The Black Death, in its early versions arriving in Europe, knocked life expectancy down to below the age of 30. And so people didn't learn skills from older craftsmen. With food, the number one priority, most people worked either in agrarian jobs or in the military. And as things went from bad to worse with the coinage, the art of portraiture was completely lost. Centuries later, in Italy, Roman coins became a matter of study for artists. And Italian artists began to try their hands at medallic art in a period known as the Renaissance. The coins and medals were being designed by painters and sculptors who decided to try their hand at medallic portraits on flat surfaces, and this led to the revival of portraits, which eventually began to appear on coins. So the path from the ancient Greek and Romans led through some pretty strange places, including Wamba and Olaf the Hedgehog, who wins my award for the worst coin portrait in history. And that's pretty much it, although there were some other ones trying to win. So picking a runner-up would be difficult. And that's pretty much what I've got for you tonight. Here are my sources and references for the chronology and the images that I used. I'm not going to read it to you. You can take a look at it. I can put it up again later if you request. Much of what I presented here tonight is my own interpretations based on having spent over 40 years now studying ancient to medieval and early modern coinage. You won't find this lesson in most textbooks because I don't think anyone's ever presented it. But that's what I've got for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to end the presentation here